The late autumn chill bites at Jedediah Stone's exposed skin as he climbs into the hayloft, the scent of dry grass and old wood familiar as his own breath. He's reaching for the pitchfork when a sound stops him, a faint, mewling cry, almost lost in the whisper of wind through the barn's loose slats. It's not a cat, it's too human. He freezes, listening. There it is again, a tiny, distressed whimper. Jed moves towards the shadowed corner, his heart suddenly thumping a wary rhythm against his ribs. There, nestled in a hollow of hay, wrapped in a thin, worn shawl, is a baby. Its face is red, scrunched in discomfort, tiny fists flailing. He stares, disbelief warring with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. This is his barn, his land, and this is a life, abandoned. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The air in the loft is cold enough to see his breath, and the child is barely covered. How long has it been here? He looks around, a hard knot forming in his gut. No sign of anyone. Just the baby, alone, and with a surge of rough tenderness he didn't know he possessed, Jedediah Stone scooped up the infant, his life, and the life of a yet unseen mother. Irrevocably altered by the silent plea in a hay-filled manger. Jedediah Stone was a man carved from the stark loneliness of the plains, his days measured by the sun's arc and the needs of his small, struggling cattle ranch. His cabin was a testament to solitude, functional, sparse, with little room for softness. The discovery of the infant had shattered that quiet austerity. He'd carried the baby, a girl by the looks of her, back to the cabin, his mind racing. He wasn't equipped for this. He had no milk, no cradle, no knowledge of what such a small creature required beyond warmth and a dry blanket. His first, awkward attempts to care for her were a study in fumbling desperation. He diluted some cow's milk with boiled water, hoping it wouldn't poison the child, feeding it to her drop by drop from his cleanest finger, then from a piece of rag soaked in the mixture. She was so small, her skin like fragile parchment. He'd stayed up all night, the baby bundled in his arms by the dying fire, listening to every breath, every sigh, a profound sense of responsibility settling over him. The next morning, driven by necessity, he rode into the small, dusty town of Redemption. The name had always struck him as ironic, given the judgmental eyes that followed any stranger or anyone who stepped outside the narrow lines of propriety. He needed supplies, proper milk, if such a thing could be bought for an infant, nappies, something. News of a bachelor rancher buying baby things would travel faster than a tumbleweed in a gale. He tied his horse Bess outside Miller's general store, the baby still bundled securely against his chest, hidden beneath his heavy coat. He could feel the stares already. Mrs. Miller, a woman whose face seemed permanently pursed in disapproval, raised an eyebrow when he asked, his voice gruff, for anything suitable for a very young infant. "A baby, Mr. Stone?" she'd inquired, her tone laced with insinuation. "Whose, might I ask?" "Foundling," he'd grunted, unwilling to offer more. The word hung in the air, ripe with implication. A foundling meant an abandonment. An abandonment meant a mother who had shirked her duty, a woman of loose morals, no doubt. He saw the calculation in Mrs. Miller's eyes, the way her gaze flickered to the bulge under his coat. By the time he left the store with a few meager supplies, some tinned milk, a bolt of soft flannel, and a stern lecture on the sinfulness of the world, the whispers had already begun. He heard them as he passed the saloon, a snippet of conversation from two women by the dressmakers. In his own hayloft, can you imagine? And, shameless hussy, leaving her get like that. The town, starved for scandal, had already woven its narrative. A fallen woman had birthed a child in secret and, in her wickedness, abandoned it on the property of a lone man. The identity of this phantom mother was, for now, a delicious mystery, but her condemnation was assured. Jed felt a cold anger settle in his chest. They knew nothing. He rode back to his ranch, the weight of the baby a warm, living counterpoint to the chill of the town's judgment. The isolation of his land, once a simple fact of his existence, now felt like a sanctuary. Here, at least, the child was safe from prying eyes and wagging tongues. He named her Grace, for it felt like a small miracle she had survived the cold night alone. The first few days were a blur of awkward care. Jed learned to change her, to coax the diluted milk into her, to recognize the subtle shifts in her cries. He fashioned a makeshift cradle from a sturdy wooden crate, lining it with an old sheepskin. The cabin, once so silent, was now filled with the small sounds of an infant, gurgles, whimpers, the occasional startling wail. He found himself talking to her, his voice low and gentle, a tone he rarely used with anyone. He told her about the ranch, about Bess, about the way the prairie looked at sunrise. She couldn't understand, of course, but the act of speaking seemed to soothe them both. The loneliness he hadn't fully acknowledged before now pressed in, but it was different. It was a loneliness shared, in a strange way, with this tiny, helpless creature who depended on him for everything. He wondered about her mother. What desperation could drive a woman to leave her child in a hayloft? Was she desperate or cruel, as the town supposed? He found it hard to believe anyone could willingly abandon something so perfect, so vulnerable. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, rattling the window panes, Grace began to cry with a fierceness that alarmed him. He walked her, he rocked her, he sang tuneless, wordless songs. Nothing seemed to work. He was exhausted, frustration mounting, when he heard a faint sound outside, above the rising wind, a scratching at the door. He tensed, peering through the grimy window. A figure stood hunched on his porch, little more than a rain-soaked shadow. He opened the door a crack, his hand instinctively going to the old shotgun he kept propped beside it. A young woman, drenched and shivering, looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with rain and tears. Her eyes, wide and haunted, fixed on the bundle in his arms. "My baby," she whispered, her voice raspy, broken. "Please, my baby." Jed stared at her, then down at Grace, who had momentarily quieted, as if sensing the shift in the air. This, then, was the mother. Not a phantom, but a flesh-and-blood woman, looking half-starved and utterly desperate. His mind, conditioned by the town's venom, briefly flashed with their accusations. But looking at her, at the raw anguish in her eyes, he saw not wickedness, but profound suffering. He made a decision then, one that went against the grain of redemption's harsh justice, but felt right in the marrow of his bones. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "before you catch your death." The woman, whose name he learned was Elara, practically fell inside. She was young, barely more than a girl, her clothes thin and soaked through. She sank onto the stool he offered by the fire, her gaze never leaving the baby in his arms. Jed watched her, a mixture of suspicion and a reluctant empathy stirring within him. He held Grace a moment longer then. Seeing the almost unbearable longing in Elara's eyes, he carefully placed the infant into her outstretched, trembling arms. Elara clutched Grace to her breast, a sob escaping her lips, burying her face in the baby's blanket. Grace, as if recognizing a familiar scent or touch, nuzzled against her, her tiny cries subsiding into soft coos. The connection between them was palpable, a raw, undeniable bond that transcended circumstance. Jed turned away, busying himself by adding wood to the stove, giving them a semblance of privacy. The small cabin felt crowded now, filled with an unspoken tension and a maelstrom of emotions. He made a pot of strong, bitter coffee and found an old, dry blanket for Ilara. She accepted it with a mumbled word of thanks, her attention still riveted on her child. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice low. "Why leave her in the hayloft?" It wasn't an accusation, more a bewildered question. Ilara flinched, looking up at him, fear flickering in her eyes. She was clearly terrified, not just of him, but of something larger, something unseen. I had to," she stammered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I didn't know what else to do. I hoped someone good would find her." Her gaze met his, pleading for understanding. "I was watching. From the trees, I saw you take her. I knew she'd be warm." He considered her words. It was a desperate act, yes, but perhaps not a malicious one. "Who are you running from?" he asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Her face crumpled. My husband's family," she whispered. "He died. Fever. They said Grace wasn't his. They said I was unclean. They wanted to take her from me, send me away. They said I wasn't fit." Jed's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of cruelty before, the way people used piety as a club to beat down the vulnerable. "And where are they?" "A town, 2 days' ride from here, Blackwood Creek. I ran. I've been running for weeks, sleeping rough. I had nothing left. I was so scared for her, for Grace." She looked down at the baby, her expression a mix of fierce love and utter despair. "I couldn't let them have her." He believed her. There was a truth in her ragged state, in the terror that still clung to her like the dampness of the storm. The town of redemption would not see it that way. They would see only a woman who had abandoned her child, a story that fit their preconceived notions of sin and punishment. "You can stay the night," Jed said, his decision solidifying. "Get warm, get dry, we'll figure something out in the morning." Ilara looked at him, tears welling in her eyes again, but this time they seemed to hold a flicker of gratitude, of fragile hope. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." The storm raged outside, but within the small cabin, a tentative peace settled. Ilara, dry now in some of his oversized, mended clothes, held Grace, humming a soft lullaby. Jed watched them, a strange ache in his chest. He was a solitary man, unused to company, especially the company of a woman and child. Yet their presence didn't feel entirely unwelcome. It felt necessary. He knew, with a grim certainty, that sheltering Ilara would bring trouble. The town's suspicion of him would solidify into outright condemnation. But looking at the exhausted mother and the sleeping infant, he found he didn't much care what redemption thought. He had found a baby in his hayloft, and now he had found her mother. His responsibility, it seemed, extended to them both. This was no longer just about a foundling. It was about protecting a family, however fragmented and fragile it might be. The first test of their fragile arrangement came sooner than he expected, not from the town, but from the simple pressing needs of the baby. Grace woke in the night, wailing, and Ilara, still weak and exhausted, struggled to soothe her. Jed, accustomed to the infant's cries by now, got up and warmed some more of the diluted cow's milk. He showed Ilara how he'd been feeding her with the rag, and she took over, her touch infinitely more practiced and gentle than his own. Watching her, he saw not the shameless hussy the town imagined, but a mother, plain and simple, doing her best in impossible circumstances. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. The respite, however, was short-lived. Mid-morning, a rider approached the cabin. Jed recognized him instantly, Sheriff Brody, a man who generally preferred to let the citizens of Redemption sort out their own squabbles, unless things got too loud or too scandalous. "Morning, Stone," Brody said, his eyes taking in the cabin, lingering on the wisp of smoke from the chimney, a sign of occupancy that was perhaps more active than usual. "Heard some talk in town about you finding a baby." Jed nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's right. And the mother?" Brody pressed, his gaze sharp. "Any sign of her?" Ilara, who had been inside trying to get Grace back to sleep, appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Jed saw the fear in her eyes, but also a spark of defiance. Brody's eyebrows shot up. "Well, now, looks like the mystery's solved itself." His tone was not unkind, but it was official. "Ma'am, there are folks in town saying some pretty harsh things. Accusations of abandonment." "I didn't abandon her," Ilara said, her voice trembling but clear. "I left her where I knew she'd be found and cared for. I was desperate." "Desperation makes people do unfortunate things," Brody acknowledged, "but the town council, especially Mrs. Henderson and her League of Concerned Citizens, they're calling for an inquiry. They want to know if you're a fit mother." Jed stepped forward slightly, placing himself subtly between Ilara and the sheriff. "She's a good mother," he stated, his voice flat and firm. "The baby's healthy. She was fleeing a bad situation." Brody looked from Jed to Ilara and back again. He was a man who dealt in facts, but he was also aware of the power of public opinion in a town like Redemption. "That may be so, Stone. But perception is a powerful thing. There's talk of her being wayward." He directed his next words to Ilara. "They'll want to hear your story, ma'am, and they'll want to judge it." This was the first direct challenge, and Jed felt Ilara shrink slightly beside him. He placed a hand on her arm, a small, steadying gesture. "She'll tell her story when she's ready," Jed said, "and not to a kangaroo court whipped up by gossip." Sheriff Brody sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I'm just the messenger, Stone. But be warned, this ain't going away. Mrs. Henderson is already talking about finding a proper home for the child." The threat hung heavy in the air. A proper home, meaning not with a mother they'd already condemned, and certainly not in the care of a gruff, solitary rancher. After Brody left, a heavy silence filled the cabin. Ilara sank onto the stool, her face ashen. "They'll take her from me," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I know they will." "Not if I can help it," Jed said, his voice rough with a resolve that surprised even himself. He didn't know Ilara well, didn't know if her entire story was true, but he knew injustice when he saw it, and he knew the vulnerability of the child in the cradle. He was beginning to understand that his life was no longer just his own. Over the next few days, Jed and Ilara fell into a quiet rhythm, dictated by Grace's needs. He taught Ilara how to milk his one cantankerous cow, Bess, so they'd have fresh milk for the baby and for themselves. She, in turn, showed a surprising aptitude for mending his worn clothes, her stitches neat and small. They shared meager meals, often in silence, but it was a silence that was slowly becoming less awkward, more companionable. He learned small things about her, the way she hummed softly when she rocked Grace, the determined set of her jaw when she spoke of her dead husband's cruel family, the flicker of a smile when Grace gurgled happily. Ilara, in turn, began to see beyond Jed's gruff exterior. She saw the way his large, calloused hands were surprisingly gentle with Grace, the quiet concern in his eyes when the baby fretted, the unwavering way he'd stood up to Sheriff Brody. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He offered safety, a shield against the world that had treated her so harshly. One afternoon, Jed had to ride into Redemption for more supplies. He was reluctant to leave Elara and Grace alone, but their flour was running low. As he'd expected, the atmosphere in Miller's store was thick with unspoken judgment. Mrs. Miller served him with pursed lips and cold eyes. "Heard the mother turned up," she said, unable to contain her curiosity or her disapproval. "A bold one, isn't she, to show her face after what she did?" "She did what she had to protect her child," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. He wasn't a man prone to anger, but the casual cruelty of the town was beginning to wear on his patience. "Protect her," scoffed a voice from near the pickle barrel. It was Martha Henderson, a woman whose piety was matched only by her penchant for gossip and control. She was flanked by two other women, their expressions equally severe. "By abandoning her in a barn like unwanted livestock. That's not protection, Mr. Stone. That's sin. And it needs to be answered for." "The child is safe and well cared for," Jed retorted, meeting Mrs. Henderson's gaze squarely. "For now, Mrs." Henderson said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "But is she with decent, God-fearing people, or with a woman of questionable character and a man who sees fit to harbor her?" Her eyes raked over Jed, implying a scandalous arrangement that hadn't even crossed Jed's mind, but now made his ears burn. "The good people of Redemption are concerned, Mr. Stone. Deeply concerned. We believe that child deserves a proper Christian upbringing, away from influences." The threat was more direct now, more insidious. They weren't just judging Elara, they were judging him too, and threatening to use the baby as a weapon. Jed clenched his fists, a cold fury rising within him. He bought his flour and supplies, his movements stiff, and left the store without another word, the women's condemnatory stares burning into his back. The ride home was filled with a grim resolve. This wasn't just about Elara anymore. It was about Grace, and about his own sense of right and wrong. He wouldn't let these self-righteous hypocrites tear a mother from her child, or dictate who was fit to offer care and protection. When he returned to the cabin, Elara was sitting on the porch step, darning one of his shirts, Grace asleep in the crate beside her. The domestic scene struck him with an unexpected poignancy. This small, fragile family unit they had become, born of desperation and circumstance, felt more real, more vital than anything he had known in years. He told her about the encounter in the store, about Mrs. Henderson's thinly veiled threats. Elara's face grew pale, but she didn't crumble. Instead, a spark of anger lit her eyes. "They know nothing about me," she said, her voice tight. "Nothing about what I've been through. It's easier for them to believe the worst." "They'll try to take Grace," Jed said quietly. "We need to be ready for that." Elara looked at him, her gaze searching his. "Why are you doing this, Jedediah? Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." He looked out over the vast, empty prairie, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "I know what it's like to be alone," he said finally, his voice gruff. "And I know that baby deserves her mother, and her mother," he paused, then met her gaze, "deserves a chance." A small, almost imperceptible shift occurred between them then. The fear in Elara's eyes lessened, replaced by a tentative trust. She saw not just a protector, but a man of quiet integrity, a man who understood, perhaps, more than he let on. That evening, as they ate their simple supper of stew and biscuits, Elara began to talk. She told him more about her husband, a kind young farmer named Thomas, and how his family had never approved of her, thinking her too poor, too plain. She spoke of their brief happiness. shattered by his sudden death. She described the cruelty of his parents and brothers, who had immediately sought to cast her out, to claim the small farm and deny Thomas's paternity of Grace to avoid any claim she might have. Her flight had been one of terror and desperation, with Grace her only solace, her only reason to keep going. Jed listened, his expression grim. He'd seen such greed and malice before. Her story, raw and painful, rang true. The town of redemption, with its sanctimonious judgments, seemed a pale imitation of the real wickedness Ilara had faced. His resolve to protect her, and Grace hardened into tempered steel. He was no hero, just a plain man, but he wouldn't stand by and let injustice prevail, not on his land, not under his roof. The pressure from the town didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified. Scornful glances followed Jed whenever he had to go to redemption. Tradesmen who had once been cordial were now curt, their business transactions clipped and unfriendly. Whispers followed him like shadows, painting him as a fool at best, a sinner at worst, for harboring Ilara. Mrs. Henderson and her league made it their mission to stir up sentiment against the fallen woman and her complicit protector. They spoke of petitioning the circuit judge, due in town in a few weeks, to have Grace removed from Ilara's care and placed in the orphanage, or with a more suitable family. The threat of the circuit judge loomed large. Jed knew that if it came to a formal hearing, Ilara's word, the word of an outsider with a tainted past, would count for little against the collective voice of redemption's righteous. He found himself lying awake at night, Grace's soft breathing the only sound in the cabin besides Ilara's quiet sighs from her makeshift bed on the other side of the room. The weight of their predicament pressed down on him. He was growing attached to them, to this semblance of family, and the thought of it being torn apart filled him with a cold dread. Ilara, too, felt the strain. She rarely left the cabin now, fearful of encountering anyone from the town. She poured her energy into caring for Grace and into the small tasks that made the cabin more of a home, mending, cleaning, even trying her hand at baking with their meager supplies. She and Jed spoke more freely now, their conversations no longer stilted or wary. They talked of the land, of their pasts, though Jed remained taciturn about his own, of their hopes and fears for the future, however uncertain it might be. One evening, Grace was fussing, a low-grade fever making her irritable. Ilara walked the floor with her, her face etched with worry. Jed watched them, his heart aching for her anxiety. He'd seen livestock sick, knew the helplessness of it. "Let me take her for a bit," he offered, his voice gentle. Ilara hesitated, then gratefully handed Grace over. Jed held the warm, fretful baby against his shoulder, humming a tuneless melody, the same one he'd used in those first few nights. Slowly, Grace's cries subsided, her small body relaxing against him. Ilara watched them, a soft, sad smile on her face. "You're good with her, Jedediah," she said quietly. "She trusts you. She's easy to care for," he deflected, though he knew it was more than that. A bond had formed, an unspoken affection that tied him to this child as surely as if she were his own. "They called Thomas a fool for marrying me," Ilara said suddenly, her voice laced with old pain. "His mother said I was common, that I'd bring him nothing but trouble. After he died, they said Grace was a bastard, that I'd shamed their name by even claiming Thomas as her father. They wanted to erase us." She looked at Jed, her eyes filled with a desperate plea for belief. "She is his, Jedediah. She has his eyes." "I believe you, Ilara," he said simply, his gaze steady. And he did. There was no deceit in her, only a deep, abiding love for her child and a weariness that came from fighting battles no one should have to fight alone. This quiet admission, This simple statement of faith seemed to unburden Ilara in a way that surprised them both. A fragile hope began to bloom in the small cabin, a sense that perhaps, together, they could weather the storm that was gathering. The following Sunday, Mrs. Henderson, bolder than ever, made her move. She arrived at Jed's cabin not alone, but accompanied by the mayor, a portly, self-important man named Thaddeus Grimshaw, and, to Jed's dismay, Sheriff Brody, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Stone," Mayor Grimshaw began, his voice booming with false bonhomie, "we've come on a matter of civic concern." Jed stood in the doorway, blocking their entry, his expression like granite. "What concern is that, Mayor?" Mrs. Henderson pushed forward. "It concerns the welfare of that child and the unsuitable arrangement here." Her eyes, like chips of ice, fixed on Ilara, who stood just behind Jed, Grace held tightly in her arms. "We, the concerned citizens of Redemption, have petitioned for the child to be placed in more appropriate care, until the circuit judge can make a formal ruling, of course." "Appropriate care?" Jed repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You mean tear her from her mother?" "A mother who abandoned her," Mrs. Henderson declared triumphantly. "She did not abandon her." Jed's voice rose, a rare display of outward anger. "She was desperate, fleeing for her life and her child's. Something you, madam, in your comfortable righteousness, wouldn't know the first thing about." Mayor Grimshaw puffed out his chest. "Now see here, Stone, there's no call for disrespect. We are simply trying to uphold the moral standards of this community." "Your standards," Jed shot back. "Your standards involve judging and condemning without knowing a single true fact. Your standards involve tormenting a grieving widow and trying to steal her child." Ilara stepped forward then, her fear palpable, but her voice surprisingly strong. "I am her mother. Grace is my daughter. I love her. You have no right." Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Love? A woman like you wouldn't know the meaning of the word. Sheriff, we have a petition signed by half the town. We demand you remove the child." Sheriff Brody looked torn. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man with a conscience, however buried it might be under the weight of civic pressure. "Mrs. Henderson," he began, "I can't just take a child without a court order unless there's evidence of immediate harm." "Immediate harm?" Mrs. Henderson shrieked, her face contorting. "Being raised by a harlot and her paramour, that's harm enough." The accusation, ugly and baseless, hung in the air. Jed felt Ilara tremble beside him. He saw the smug satisfaction on Mrs. Henderson's face, the indecision on the mayor's. This was it, the moment where they either broke or stood firm. Jed took a deep breath. He looked at Ilara, at the fierce protective love in her eyes as she clutched Grace. He looked at the self-righteous faces of their accusers, and he made his choice. "Ilara is not what you call her," Jed said, his voice ringing with conviction, clear and strong enough to carry across the yard. "She is a good woman, a good mother. And if you want to take this child, you'll have to go through me." He took another step forward, positioning himself squarely in front of Ilara and Grace. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration. He was no longer just a reluctant protector. He was their defender. Then, Ilara did something unexpected. Her hand fumbled at the neck of her worn dress, and she pulled out a thin, tarnished silver chain. Dangling from it was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, clutched in Grace's tiny hand. "This," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "was a gift from my Thomas. He carved it himself, for Grace, before she was even born. He loved her. He loved me." She looked directly at Mrs. Oath. "Henderson, you can call me whatever names you like. You can try to take my child, but you cannot take away the truth, and you cannot break a mother's love." Her words, simple and heartfelt, seemed to momentarily silence the accusers. There was a dignity in her stance, a raw honesty in her voice that even Mrs. Henderson couldn't immediately refute. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably. "Folks," he said, his voice firming, "I see no immediate danger to the child here. I see a mother caring for her baby, and a man offering them shelter. Until the circuit judge arrives and makes a ruling, I have no grounds to intervene further. I suggest you all go home." Mrs. Henderson looked aghast. "Sheriff, you can't just—" "I can and I am," Brody stated, his gaze steady. He looked at Jed and Alara. "But be prepared. The judge will hear this case. You'll need to make your arguments then." He tipped his hat, a gesture that might have held a hint of grudging respect, and turned, gesturing for the mayor and a sputtering Mrs. Henderson to follow. They left, defeated for the moment, but the threat remained, the circuit judge. Jed and Alara watched them go, the silence in the yard profound. Then, Alara turned to Jed, tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of relief and of a fierce, fragile hope. "Thank you, Jedediah," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You stood for us." He looked at her, at the strength she had shown, at the unwavering love for her child. "We stood together," he corrected, his voice softer than he intended. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child thrown together by circumstance. They were a unit, bound by shared adversity and a growing, unspoken affection. The battle was not yet won, but they had faced their accusers and found, in each other, the courage to stand their ground. The cabin, once a symbol of Jed's solitude, now felt like a fortress, small but resolute, against the harsh judgments of the world. The days leading up to the circuit judge's arrival were fraught with a quiet tension. Jed and Alara spoke little of the impending hearing, but it hung over them like a persistent shadow. Instead, they focused on the small routines that had come to define their shared existence. Jed worked his ranch, mending fences, tending his small herd, always aware of Alara and Grace back at the cabin. Alara, in turn, made the small space as homelike as possible, her presence bringing a warmth and order it had never known. She cooked, she cleaned, she sang to Grace, her voice a soft counterpoint to the harsh winds that swept across the prairie. They found a surprising comfort in each other's company. He would watch her sometimes, as she rocked Grace by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light, and a strange feeling would stir in his chest, something akin to tenderness, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in many years. She, too, found herself observing him, the quiet strength in his hands, the way his gaze would soften when he looked at Grace, the unexpected kindness that lay beneath his gruff exterior. He was a good man, she realized, a man of deep integrity, and she was increasingly grateful for his unwavering support. One evening, Jed returned from checking a far pasture to find Alara staring out the window, a worried frown creasing her brow. "What is it?" he asked. "I'm scared, Jedediah," she admitted, her voice low. "What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if he listens to Mrs. Henderson and takes Grace away?" Jed came to stand beside her, looking out at the darkening landscape. "We'll tell him the truth," he said, his voice steady. "And the truth has a way of making itself heard." He paused, then added, "I'll speak for you. I'll tell him what I've seen, that you're a good mother." Alara turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You would do that? Risk your own reputation in this town for me?" He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "Some things are more important than reputation, Alara." The circuit judge, a stern, hawk-nosed man named Elias Thorne, arrived in redemption with little fanfare but an palpable air of authority. The hearing was to be held in the town hall, a small clapboard building that also served as the church on Sundays. The room was packed, the townsfolk eager for the drama to unfold. Mrs. Henderson and her league were there in force, their faces alight with righteous anticipation. Jed and Alara sat together on a hard wooden bench, Grace bundled securely in Alara's arms. Jed felt the stares, the whispers, but he kept his gaze fixed forward, his expression unreadable. Alara was pale but composed, her hand clutching the small wooden bird necklace, now a symbol of her quiet defiance. Judge Thorne listened patiently as Mrs. Henderson, representing the concerned citizens, laid out her case. She painted Alara as a woman of loose morals, a neglectful mother who had callously abandoned her child. She spoke of the need to protect Grace from an unwholesome environment, hinting darkly at the impropriety of Alara's living arrangement with Jed. Her words were laced with venom and self-righteousness, and Jed felt a slow burn of anger rise within him. Then, it was Alara's turn. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it gained strength. She told her story simply, without embellishment, her love for Thomas, his death, the cruelty of his family, her desperate flight. She spoke of leaving Grace in the hayloft, not as an act of abandonment, but as a desperate measure to ensure her safety, intending always to stay close, to find a way. She held up the small wooden bird. "My husband carved this for our daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He loved her. I love her. She is all I have left of him." When she finished, a hush fell over the room. Her sincerity was undeniable, her grief palpable. Judge Thorne then turned to Jed. "Mr. Stone," he said, his gaze piercing, "you took this woman and child into your home. What have you observed?" Jed stood, his tall frame commanding attention. He was not an eloquent man, but he spoke with a quiet conviction that resonated through the room. "I found Grace in my hayloft, cold and alone," he began, his voice steady. "And yes, I took her in. A few days later, Alara came to my door, desperate for her child. I've seen her care for Grace. I've seen her love for her. She is a good mother. She fled a terrible situation, and she did what she had to do to protect her baby." He looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. "There are those in this town who are quick to judge, quick to condemn, but they don't know the truth. Alara is a decent woman. Grace belongs with her mother." His words, stark and unequivocal, hung in the air. He had publicly defended Alara, aligning himself fully with her, against the prevailing sentiment of the town. Judge Thorne listened, his expression unreadable. He asked a few more questions, then leaned back, steepling his fingers. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. "In my years on the bench," Judge Thorne began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I have seen much of human failing, and much of human strength. I have heard tales of cruelty and tales of courage." He looked at Alara, then at Jed. "What I see here is a mother who has endured great hardship, and a man who has shown her compassion. I see no evidence that this child, Grace, is in any immediate danger. Indeed, she appears well cared for and loved." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the expectant faces of the townsfolk, lingering for a moment on Mrs. Henderson, whose face had fallen. "The bonds between a mother and child are sacred. They are not to be broken lightly, nor on the basis of gossip and speculation." He brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Petition denied. The child, Grace, will remain in the custody of her mother, Alara Vance." Another crack of the gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." A stunned silence filled the room. broken by a choked sob from Ilara. She clutched Grace tightly, burying her face in the baby's blanket, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Jed placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, a wave of immense relief washing over him. They had won. Justice, in its own slow, deliberate way, had prevailed. Mrs. Henderson and her followers looked thunderstruck, their anticipated victory snatched away. Some townsfolk began to murmur, a few even nodding in agreement with the judge's decision. Perhaps, Jed thought, a few seeds of doubt had been sown in the fertile ground of their prejudice. As they left the town hall, the crowd parted before them. The stares were still there, but they were different now, less condemnatory, more curious, perhaps even a little shamed. Sheriff Brody tipped his hat to them again, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. They walked back towards Jed's wagon in silence, the weight of the world seemingly lifted from their shoulders. The sun felt warmer, the sky brighter. Grace, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded, cooed happily in Alara's arms. When they reached the wagon, Alara turned to Jed, her eyes shining. I don't know how to thank you, Jedediah, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved us. He looked at her, at the gratitude and a new, deeper emotion in her gaze. He felt it too, this pull, this connection that had grown from shared adversity into something more profound. We saved each other, Ilara, he said, his voice gruff but tender. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, under the vast prairie sky, surrounded by a town that had judged them and found them wanting, Jedediah Stone and Ilara Vance knew they were no longer alone. They had faced the worst, and they had faced it together. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibility, full of hope. The hayloft where Grace was found no longer seemed a place of abandonment, but the unlikely sanctuary where their new lives had begun. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding that had blossomed between them. The air in the cabin that evening felt lighter, freer. Ilara hummed as she prepared their simple meal, a genuine smile gracing her lips, the haunted look in her eyes finally receding. Grace, sensing the shift in atmosphere, gurgled contentedly in her crate cradle. Jed watched them, a feeling of profound peace settling over him. The ranch, his solitary refuge, suddenly felt like a home, filled not with emptiness, but with the warmth of human connection. He had found a baby, yes, but in doing so he had found so much more. He had found a purpose beyond the daily grind of survival. He had found a strength he didn't know he possessed, and a capacity for tenderness he had long suppressed. After supper, Ilara sat mending one of his shirts by the firelight, Grace asleep beside her. Jed found himself watching the rhythmic movement of her needle, the way the light caught the strands of her hair. She looked up, catching his gaze, and a soft blush crept up her neck. Thank you again, Jedediah, she said softly, for everything. No need for thanks, Ilara, he replied, his voice a low rumble. He paused, then added, this place, it's better with you and Grace here. Her smile widened, and her eyes met his, a clear, open look that held no fear, only a gentle warmth. It feels like home, she admitted. And in that simple admission, in the quiet comfort of the small cabin, with the sleeping child breathing softly nearby, Jedediah Stone knew that the accusations and judgments of the town no longer mattered. They had found their own kind of redemption, not in the eyes of others, but in the sanctuary they had built together, a fragile haven of love and acceptance. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the mending, her fingers curled around his, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in hardship and sealed in courage. He looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully, and then at Ilara, her face soft in the firelight, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his solitary days were over. He had found more than a baby in his hayloft. He had found his heart. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.